What if I told you that being born in the wrong century could decide your entire destiny? For thousands of years, half of humanity lived under rules so strict, so brutal, that freedom wasn't even an option. And here's the shocking part. Some of the darkest periods in history look beautiful on the surface. Ancient temples, golden palaces, royal courts, but behind the curtains? Pain, control, and traditions designed to keep women silent. From ancient Mesopotamia to Imperial China, from Japan's Edo period to the Victorian Era, history is full of hidden stories society doesn't like to talk about. And once you learn them, you'll never look at the past the same way again. Ready to uncover the 10 worst times in history to be born a woman? Trust me, you'll want to see this through to the end. Ancient Mesopotamia, circa 3000 BCE, 500 BCE. Imagine living in ancient Mesopotamia, the cradle of civilization, where cities flourished, writing was born, and agriculture transformed humanity. Sounds amazing, right? Well, not if you were a woman. Back then, under the famous Code of Hammurabi, women weren't just undervalued. They were literally considered property. A single mistake, like being accused of adultery, could cost a woman her life, while men freely had multiple wives and concubines without consequence. It's hard to imagine how different daily life was compared to today. What's even more striking is how little control women had over their own choices. Forget about deciding who to marry, owning land, or pursuing an education. In ancient Mesopotamia, those rights simply didn't exist. To put it in perspective, imagine someone today being forbidden to choose their partner, career, or even what they can say in public. That's the level of restriction women faced. And yet, the men writing history considered this orderly society, which tells us a lot about where their priorities were. But here's the paradox. This era gave birth to many innovations that still shape our lives: writing, mathematics, irrigation systems, and yet, half the population was excluded from participating in them. It makes you wonder how much human progress was lost because women weren't allowed to contribute. And if you think this was extreme, wait until we step into ancient Egypt, where freedom looked different but came with its own painful realities. Ancient Egypt, circa 3100 BCE, 30 BC. When people think about ancient Egypt, they often picture powerful queens like Cleopatra or Nefertiti. But the reality for most women was far less glamorous. Behind the grand pyramids and golden tombs, everyday life was filled with restrictions. Most marriages were arranged when girls were still very young, and a woman's main role was to produce heirs and manage the household. Unlike in ancient Mesopotamia, Egyptian women had slightly more legal rights, but freedom was still incredibly limited. High maternal mortality rates made life even harder. Imagine being forced into marriage at 12 or 13, expected to have multiple children, with no access to medicine or proper care. There was no choosing your career or building your dreams. Your future was decided the moment you were born a girl. And while the elite enjoyed jewelry, education, and status, most women lived in small villages, working tirelessly to support their families under scorching desert heat. But here's the twist. Even though Egyptian society was deeply patriarchal, women were seen as the foundation of family and spiritual life. They were considered vital to maintaining balance, and yet, their opportunities remained painfully narrow. This contradiction sets the stage for our next stop. Ancient Greece, the birthplace of democracy, but only if you were a man. Things are about to get even more ironic. Ancient Greece, c. 800 BCE, 146 BCE. When you think of ancient Greece, you probably picture philosophers debating, dazzling architecture, and the birthplace of democracy. But here's the catch, that democracy, it wasn't built for everyone. For women, life was strictly controlled from the moment they were born. In cities like Athens, women couldn't vote, own land, or even attend political gatherings. Their world revolved around the household, raising children, and maintaining the family's honor. What's fascinating is how this contrasts with Sparta, where women had a bit more freedom. Spartan girls were trained in sports, educated, and encouraged to stay strong, but not for their own sake. Their purpose was to bear healthy warriors for the state. Even there, autonomy was limited, just packaged differently. Imagine being told your entire value depends on the strength of the sons you produce. That was reality for countless women across ancient Greece. And yet, Greek society praised ideals like wisdom and balance while systematically excluding half the population from achieving them. This gap between their philosophy and their practices is striking. But if you think Greece was restrictive, just wait until we step into ancient Rome, where strict laws and social expectations created an even tighter cage for women. Things were about to get a lot more complicated. Ancient Rome, c. 27 BCE, 476 CE. Ancient Rome is often remembered for its powerful emperors, grand arenas, and monumental laws. But behind that image, women lived under strict control. Legally, they were always under the authority of a man, first their father, then their husband, and sometimes even their sons. Unlike men, women couldn't manage property freely, participate in politics, or challenge family decisions. Their status depended almost entirely on the reputation and wealth of the men around them. For wealthy Roman women, life looked elegant on the surface: silk dresses, luxurious banquets, and villas filled with art, but appearances were deceiving. Social expectations demanded that they remain silent in public, modest at all times, and obedient without question. Meanwhile, poorer women carried an even heavier burden, often working as servants or being forced into slavery and sexual exploitation. For many, survival meant living entirely at the mercy of someone else's power. Ironically, Rome prided itself on its structured laws and civilized society, yet half its population had little to no voice. This contradiction shaped generations of women who had dreams, but no way to pursue them. And as we leave Rome, we enter a period where restrictions didn't just persist. They became deeply tied to religion and superstition. Welcome to the European Middle Ages, where life as a woman became even more dangerous. The European Middle Ages, 5th to 15th century. When we step into the European Middle Ages, life becomes a whole different story. And for women, it was often brutal. Society was dominated by religion, superstition, and rigid social structures. Women had little control over their own lives. Most marriages were arranged, education was rare, and legal rights were almost non-existent. Your value was tied to your family's honor, your ability to bear children, and your obedience to male authority. But it gets darker. During the Inquisition, hundreds of thousands of women were accused of witchcraft, often without evidence, and many were burned alive. Imagine living in a world where simply being knowledgeable about herbs or medicine could label you a witch. In small villages, even being independent or outspoken was dangerous. Fear was constant, and survival often meant staying silent, blending in, and hoping not to be noticed. And yet, despite these harsh realities, women still played a vital role in preserving culture, family, and community traditions. They kept stories alive, passed down knowledge, and built the foundations of local economies. But just when it seemed things couldn't get more restrictive, another society introduced one of the most painful beauty standards in history. In Imperial China, women faced a practice that literally reshaped their bodies and their entire lives. Imperial China, 10th to 19th century. In Imperial China, one of history's most extreme beauty standards shaped women's lives, quite literally. The practice of foot binding began among wealthy families and quickly spread across society. Girls as young as 4 or 5 had their feet deliberately broken, tightly bound, and reshaped to stay unnaturally small, a painful process seen as a symbol of elegance and high status. But behind this ideal of beauty was a lifetime of suffering. Bound feet, severely limited mobility, forcing many women to depend entirely on their families or husbands. Imagine being unable to walk freely, run, or even stand for long periods, all because society decided small feet were attractive. Infections, chronic pain, and permanent deformities were common, yet rejecting the practice often meant social exclusion or reduced chances of marriage. For many, there was simply no choice. Conformity was survival. What's most striking is how this custom lasted for centuries, shaping generations of women and families. It reveals just how far societies will go to control women's bodies in the name of status or beauty. And while foot binding was unique to Imperial China, other cultures created their own oppressive traditions. Next, we travel to ancient and medieval India, where spiritual customs and social structures pushed women into practices just as extreme, and sometimes even deadly. Ancient and medieval India, circa 1500 BCE, 19th century. In ancient and medieval India, religion and tradition shaped nearly every aspect of life, especially for women. The deeply rooted caste system dictated your status, opportunities, and even who you could marry. From birth, a woman's identity was tied to her family and husband, with little chance of choosing her own path. Freedom wasn't just limited for many, it simply didn't exist. One of the most extreme practices was sati, a ritual where widows were expected, or pressured, to throw themselves onto their husband's funeral pyre and be burned alive. Refusing was considered shameful and dishonorable. Child marriages were also common, with girls as young as 8 or 9 promised to much older men. These customs weren't isolated cases, they were ingrained in society, shaping generations of women's lives through fear, duty, and sacrifice. And yet, amid these oppressive norms, women still carried the weight of preserving traditions, spirituality, and family honor. They kept ancient stories alive, safeguarded rituals, and maintained cultural continuity. But as rigid as India's customs were, Japan was entering a period where societal expectations became just as strict, and women faced a new kind of control. In Japan's Edo period, honor, obedience, and social hierarchy defined every part of a woman's existence. Japan's Edo period, 1603 to 1868. During Japan's Edo period, society was built on an unshakable hierarchy where everyone had a defined place. And for women, that place was almost always at the bottom. From birth, their lives were controlled by strict codes of honor and obedience. First, they were under their father's authority, then their husbands, and eventually, even their sons. Individual freedom wasn't just rare, it was practically non-existent. For poor families, survival often came at a heartbreaking cost. Thousands of young women were sold into sex slavery across Asia, becoming known as Karyuki-san. These women were sent to foreign countries under false promises, only to face exploitation and abuse. Even within Japan, many women worked in brothels or served wealthy families under grueling conditions. In a society where reputation meant everything, challenging these roles wasn't an option. And yet, while women had so little autonomy, they carried immense responsibility, running households, raising children, and quietly sustaining entire communities. Their resilience kept families together in a world that gave them almost no power. But if you think life was harsh here, wait until we reach the Victorian Era, where society looked refined and elegant on the surface, while hiding a deeply restrictive reality beneath it all. The Victorian Era, United Kingdom, 1837 to 1901. At first glance, the Victorian Era looked like a time of elegance, refinement, and progress. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping cities, literature was flourishing, and society seemed modern on the surface. But for women, life was anything but free. They were expected to embody the angel of the house ideal, pure, silent, and devoted to family. Working, voting, owning property, or discussing topics like divorce and sexuality, completely off limits. Behind the lace dresses and grand mansions, emotional repression was the norm. Women were discouraged from showing ambition or independence, labeled hysterical if they challenged expectations. Even their education was designed to prepare them for one purpose, marriage. While some wealthy women enjoyed a life of comfort, most worked long hours in factories or as domestic servants, with little pay and even less respect. Social mobility was almost non-existent. This contradiction, modern progress alongside extreme limitations, defined the era. On one hand, society celebrated innovation. On the other, It confined women to roles that left little room for individuality. But change was slowly brewing, and as Europe transitioned into the 19th and early 20th century, industrialization opened new doors while still keeping many others firmly shut. That's where our journey goes next. 19th and early 20th century Europe. By the time we reach 19th and early 20th century Europe, you'd expect equality to finally start taking shape. But reality tells a different story. Despite industrial progress, women still couldn't vote, open bank accounts, or manage businesses without male approval. Even in more modern cities, societal expectations dictated that a woman's place was at home, raising children and supporting her husband's ambitions, not her own. During both world wars, things shifted slightly. With men on the front lines, millions of women joined the workforce, operating factories, driving public transport, and running essential industries. But here's the catch. When the wars ended, many were pushed back into domestic roles, stripped of their newfound independence. It was like society said, "Thanks for saving us. Now go back to the kitchen." Progress felt temporary, conditional, and fragile. Still, the seeds of change were planted. The fight for women's suffrage gained momentum across Europe, leading to gradual reforms after World War II. But here's the bigger question. How different would history look today if women had been allowed equal opportunities from the start? And speaking of history, some of its darkest truths aren't just about rights. They're about everyday objects, rituals, and traditions that disappeared without a trace. Let's explore that next. History can be brutal, but it also teaches us something powerful. Freedom isn't something that was handed to us. It was fought for, generation after generation. Looking back at ancient Mesopotamia, Imperial China, or the Victorian Era, it's hard not to wonder, how different would the world look today if women had always had the same opportunities as men? Now think about this. If you had to choose, which of these 10 periods would be the absolute worst time in history to be born a woman? Would it be Japan's Edo period with its harsh hierarchy? Ancient Greece, where democracy excluded half the population? Or maybe Imperial China, with its painful beauty standards? Drop your answer in the comments. I'd love to know your thoughts. And if you want to keep uncovering the stories history tried to hide, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next deep dive. Trust me, what's coming next will change the way you see the past forever.